Hello, I'm Bill Salus. The 12-day war between Israel and Iran has ended. Iran's nuclear enrichment facilities at Fordow and Natanz have been obliterated. So then what's going to be next? Is it time for peace in the Middle East? The Abraham Accords are again being presented as the political pathway to peace and prosperity between Israel and its neighbors. Can these accords achieve the lasting peace that is so desperately needed in the Middle East? Some of today's top Bible prophecy teachers suggest that the Abraham Accords could lead to the peace and safety that will lead to the start of the Ezekiel 38 prophecy, or maybe segue into the covenant of Daniel 9:27 that starts the 7-year tribulation period. So what are the Abraham Accords? What will they play a role in Bible prophecy? So stay tuned as we take a look at the Abraham Accords and answer the question, are the Abraham Accords biblical? So the Abraham Accords again have resurfaced as the model for peace and prosperity in the Middle East. Here's a recent article on June 29, 2025 from Fox News that reads, Trump teases loading up Abraham Accords with new nations after Middle East shakeup. The subcaption reads, White House suggests Syria could be among countries joining Trump's historic peace initiative. Syria? Could that even be possible? The deal of the century was Trump's administration's plan for resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It proposed a two-state solution with the Palestinian state, but with significant concessions to Israel, including Israeli annexation of parts of the West Bank. The plan was widely criticized by Palestinians and many international actors. It presented a two-part approach, a $50 billion economic plan to boost the Palestinian economy through infrastructure, education, and job creation, and a political plan that proposed a Palestinian state with limited sovereignty. The Palestinians rejected it, saying it ignored their core demands like full statehood and control over East Jerusalem. Now the Abraham Accords introduction. The Peace to Prosperity Plan and the Abraham Accords, although separate initiatives, are linked together. They are tied to reshaping Middle East diplomacy through economic incentives. The Accords were partly sold as a way to build regional momentum for broader regional peace by getting Arab states to normalize relations with Israel. The Accords attempted to prove that Mideast peace could advance without directly resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The Abraham Accords were named after Abraham to symbolize peace and unity, drawing on his role as a common patriarch in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The term was coined by U.S. officials during the Trump administration for the 2020 normalization agreements between Israel, UAE, and Bahrain, and Sudan and Morocco. So that basic understanding of the Peace to Prosperity Plan and the Abraham Accords, let's see how the Abraham Accords, the nations within the Accords presently, as well as the proposed, namely Syria and Saudi Arabia, let's see how they align with God's foreign policy in Genesis chapter 12, God's Mideast peace plan in Jeremiah chapter 12. He has a peace plan in place. These countries are also involved in Bible prophecy. Let's see how they align with the Abraham Accords. Do they match up? What about the safe dwelling people of Ezekiel 38? Is this safety going to be accomplished through the Abraham Accords? And would that even, the safety, peace and safety, lead to the covenant in Daniel 9:27 that starts the tribulation period? This will be the topics we'll sequence and go through and unpack and align and see if the Abraham Accords even align with them. So let's start first by looking at the countries involved. You see the little white blocks up there on the map? You have Bahrain to the east on the right side there. You have the UAE. You have Sudan down in Africa. And you have Morocco up to the left on the west on that slide. Now, first of all, let's note that none of these countries are really Israel's enemies. They've never really been notorious enemies of Israel. Of course, they support the Palestinian plight, but they're not really, Israel's not really been at war with these places. Remember that this Abraham Accords was trying to reshape Middle East diplomacy through economic incentives. And by signing on to these accords, Sudan got a $1.2 billion loan to pay off its world debt. Morocco acknowledging Moroccan sovereignty over the Western Sahara. That's what they got. U.S. acknowledged their sovereignty over the Western Sahara. The UAE got a surge in trade of almost $3 billion by 2023, potentially get up to $10 billion they estimate by 2030. Bahrain increased its trade with investment opportunities with Israel, particularly in technology and healthcare, and direct flights to and fro. So we see that they had economic incentives that make it lucrative for them to be involved. All right, so let's start with God's foreign policy in Genesis chapter 12. We'll start by taking a look at the unconditional covenant, the Abrahamic covenant that God made with Abraham. He was promised to be a great nation with a great name. He would have descendants forever, that we call those the chosen people. They would be given a promised land. They would have an eternal king that would be the Messiah, Jesus Christ. And of course, they would have an eternal law to govern over them. We find that it's in Genesis chapter 12, God issued his foreign policy, and he said, I will bless those who bless you. This is Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, talking to Abraham, and I will curse him who curses you, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. We're going to find out actually in his seed, all the families of the earth would be blessed. We'll get there in just a moment. He went on to promise him a family tree forever. In Genesis 13, verses 15, he says, for all the land which you see, I will give to you and your descendants forever. We find out in Genesis 22, verses 17, multiplying, I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven and as the sand which is on the seashore. The chosen people, a family tree forever. Find out how big the land's going to be, the promised land in Genesis 15, verses 18. On the same day the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, saying to your descendants, I have given the land from the river of Egypt, the great river, to the great river Euphrates, which courses through modern-day Iraq and Syria. We find out that it's in the seed of Abraham that all the families of the earth would be blessed. But not only just Abraham, but it also we find out in Genesis 22:18, Genesis 26:24, it goes through to Isaac, in your seed all the families of the earth will be blessed. Unto his son, Abraham's grandson Jacob. Genesis 28, verse 14. Find out that in your seed, meaning the Messiah, Jesus Christ, through this lineage, all the families of the earth will be blessed. So it's God's benevolent plan for mankind, the plan of salvation. We pick it up in the Davidic covenant, amplification of Abraham's covenant, in 2 Samuel 7 verses 12 through 13, where we find that this is going to lead us to understand that Jesus Christ is the Messiah, the seed of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We're told, when your days are fulfilled and you rest with your father, speaking of King David, I will set up your seed after you, who will come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. And here's what we find out in the New Testament, that he was speaking the throne of David, he was speaking about Jesus Christ. John 7, verse 42, Romans 1, verse 3, 2 Timothy 2, verse 8, we say that Christ is the seed of David. Luke 1, verse 32 through 33 says, he will be great, and he will be called the Son of the Highest, and the Lord God will give him the throne of his father, David, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there will be no end. So it's a benevolent plan for mankind. It is the plan of salvation coming through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob on through David. The seed, as the families will be blessed through the seed, the Messiah. So that's the Abrahamic covenant. Now let's look and see how these countries that are proposed to be part of the Abraham Accords, let's see how they line up with this Abrahamic covenant. So we learn from the Abrahamic covenant that God has a benevolent plan for mankind, a plan of salvation that was to be distributed through the Hebrew lineage of Abraham, Isaac, his grandson Jacob, who had 12 sons, the 12 tribes of Israel. So we're talking about Abraham's descendants on through to the Israel. We'll read it again here. I will bless those who bless you. This is God's foreign policy. If you bless Abraham and his descendants, you're in right standing with God's plan of benevolence, his plan of salvation. But I will curse him who curses you. So in other words, if you curse Abraham and his descendants, you're in wrong standing. You're antagonizing God's benevolent plan. Matter of fact, the language in Hebrew is quite forceful. If you curse them, I must curse you for cursing them. So with that backdrop, let's look at Saudi Arabia, for instance, who's maybe the next participant of the Abraham Accords. They're being courted for that purpose. How are they in standing with blessing Israel? September 26th of 2023, the Arab News reports that the Arab Peace Initiative, which was put together by Saudi Arabia, is a cornerstone of any deal with Israel, said the Saudi envoy, Naif al-Sudani. He's the ambassador to Palestine. You see him there in a picture with Mahmoud Abbas of the Palestinian Authority. Recently, dealing with the ceasefire in the Gaza, this article came out, and it basically says, asked about normalization with Israel, Saudi foreign minister says Gaza ceasefire takes priority before any normalization. And here's what it says. Faisal bin Farhan al-Saud says truce would be a prelude to Palestinian statehood. Trump said to meet secretly with Saudi defense minister to discuss normalization. Asked about normalization with Israel, Saudi Foreign Minister Prince Faisal bin Farhan al-Saud said Friday that the kingdom's priority is to end the war in Gaza as a prelude to the establishment of a Palestinian state. The comments came a day after U.S. President Donald Trump reportedly hosted Saudi Defense Minister Khalid bin Farhan al-Saud to discuss normalization with Israel and de-escalation with the Iran amid reports that the U.S. is looking to secure Israel and Saudi and Israel-Syrian normalization. So the point being, they want a Palestinian state. They want to take parts of the Promised Land and give it to the Palestinians, which is not blessing Israel at all. It's cursing Israel. Matter of fact, let's look at the terms of the Palestinian Initiative from a video teaching that I did not too long ago. So now let's take a look at this Arab Peace Initiative, the so-called cornerstone for Saudi Arabia to normalize relationships with Israel. This is nothing new. This was introduced by Saudi Arabia at the Beirut Arab League Summit in 2002. It was signed by the 22 Arab League states at that time. And here's what it calls for. This is the request from Israel. Full Israeli withdrawal from all the territories occupied since 1967, including the Syrian Golan Heights to the June 4th, 1967 lines, as well as the remaining occupied Lebanese territories in the south of Lebanon. But there's more, an achievement of a just solution to the Palestinian refugee problem. They want to deal with the Palestinian refugees. To be agreed upon in accordance with the UN General Assembly Resolution 194, which deals with the right of return of the Palestinian refugees, the right of return back into Israel proper, into what they would declare was their former homes and towns, which has always been a no-go for Israel. Number 3, the acceptance of the establishment of a sovereign independent Palestinian state on the Palestinian territories occupied since June 4th, 1967 in the West Bank, and with East Jerusalem as its capital. So in other words, they want land. They want land for peace. They want parts of the Promised Land, land that Israel acquired in their victory in the Six-Day War back in June of 1967. And this is not biblically endorsed, people. This is what they want. But what do they promise to give Israel should Israel comply and accept this Arab Peace Initiative? They would consider the Arab-Israeli conflict ended and enter into a peace agreement with Israel and provide security for all the states of the region. It would establish normal relationships with Israel in the context of this comprehensive peace, and enabling the Arab countries and Israel to live in peace and as in good neighborliness. So just give us a bunch of land and we'll let you live where you live in peace, your ancient homeland, but we want your land. It's basically what they're saying. So they're on the heels of the Abraham Accords that Donald Trump put together with Bahrain, the UAE, Sudan, and Morocco. The Biden administration thinks that Saudi Arabia will step in line with this, but you need to remember that the Palestinian statehood has always been the bedrock of any kind of a deal with normalizing relationships with Israel. Even Bahrain, here's a headline, back from Bahrain back in December 4th of 2022 in the Jerusalem Post. The Bahraini foreign minister says the Palestinian statehood is the bedrock of the Abraham Accords success. So that's part of what they said. What about the UAE? How do they feel? This is the Arab News reports the UAE is committed to a two-state solution in Palestine, says the UAE minister. So this is what they're after. So we see from the Arab Peace Initiative, it's not about blessing Israel. They're cursing Israel, but if Israel will give them land for a Palestinian state, they'll back off from the cursing. So it's not blessing Israel at all. But what about Bahrain and the UAE? They're also advocates for the Arab Peace Initiative. They're current signers on the Abraham Accords. Here's an article about Bahrain on December 4th, 2022, a few years back. It says the Bahraini foreign minister, Palestinian statehood is the bedrock of the Abraham Accords success. The Abraham Accords ultimately will only succeed if a two-state resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is achieved, the foreign minister said. So clearly they're saying it's the bedrock of any kind of success for the Abraham's Accord. Along those same lines, here's the UAE comment. In February of this year, 2025, on Reuters reports, the UAE president tells U.S. a two-state solution is key for peace in the region, state news agency says. It reads, the UAE President Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan told U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio on Wednesday that peace efforts in the region should be on the basis of a two-state solution for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It said the UAE, one of the Arab countries that normalized relations with Israel, categorically rejected any attempt to displace the Palestinians and deny them inalienable rights. So in other words, they're talking about the plan that Trump is putting forward presently to take people in the Gaza who voluntarily want to go to different countries, that they can migrate out there. They're opposed to the categorically rejecting this idea. So let's turn our attention to Syria. What's going to drive them to the bargaining table to normalize relationships with Israel? They have a need as well. We find out in July 3rd article of 2025 on I-24, it says, no such thing as peace for free. Syria demands 1/3 of the Golan for peace with Israel. Syria is demanding that Israel hand over at least 1/3 of the Golan Heights territory seized by Israel prior to the 1974 armistice agreement. So their new leader, Mohammed al-Julani, who is the leader of the HTS, a Syrian Islamic militant group, they want Israel to recede from the Golan Heights, the area they captured when he became the leader of Syria and Assad fled. Israel moved in and took over more area around the Golan Heights area. So he wants them to recede back away from that. Now, Donald Trump recently waived sanctions on Syria in a bid to entice al-Julani to normalize relationships with Israel. So we see them like Bahrain, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia. They have their needs. They want, in their case, they want land. They want the Jews to recede out of the area of the Golan. We're talking about God's Middle East peace plan now that we've looked at God's foreign policy and how the Arabs don't align with it. So you see that Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and the UAE and Syria are out of sync with God's foreign policy. They're not blessing Israel as prescribed in Genesis 12, verse 3. But God also has a Middle East peace plan inscribed in Jeremiah chapter 12. Let's take a look at that, and we'll see how they align with that, these various Arab nations and states.
So man has a peace plan for Israel, but God also has a peace plan for Israel.
He does. You know, the Lord knew, and he had this come out with Jeremiah around 590 BC. He points this out because the prophecies had talked about a time when the Jews would come back out of the nations of the world into the land of Israel. And we saw this beginning its fulfillment in 1948 when Israel was reborn again. And God knew, knowing the end from the beginning, that would be an issue.
Yes.
Because the ancient Arab hatred had not gone away. They still hated the Jews. It was now blanketed in the religion of Islam. So he knew that he would have to create a resettlement program to bring the Jews back into their land and take the Arabs out of the Jews' land, put them back into their states. And so what he says in Jeremiah chapter 12, verses 14 through 17, it says in Jeremiah, this was God's compassionate peace plan. Thus says the Lord God, Jeremiah chapter 12, against my evil neighbors. Notice what he's calling the neighborhood over there, the Arabs around Israel. He's calling them evil neighbors who touch the inheritance which I caused my people Israel to inherit. That is dealing with the land, the promised land of Israel. Behold, I will pluck them out of their land and pluck out the house of Judah from among them. Forceful language. I will pluck the Arabs out of the land that's going to be Israel, and I will pluck the Jews who had been during the diaspora into those Arab states. I'm going to pluck them out and bring them back into the land of Israel. And he says, and I will return and have compassion on them and bring them back, everyone to his heritage and everyone to his land. This is a compassionate land for peace deal. He's going to give the Arabs their states back. And we see this happen after World War I with the Ottoman Empire being collapsed. You had I think it was Egypt around 1922, Iraq around 1935, Syria and Jordan, Saudi Arabia 1935, Syria and Jordan, I believe that was around 1946, and then Israel 1948. We're talking about a land for peace deal extraordinaire. God has resettled those environments there. But he goes on to say this, and it's a compassionate plan, perfect plan, it would work. And he did what he was supposed to sovereignly to make that happen. And Israel gets rebirthed in 1948. But he goes on to say in verses 16 and 17 of Jeremiah chapter 12, and it shall be, if they will learn carefully the ways of my people, they, meaning those evil neighbors that got their Arab states, if they will learn the ways of my people to swear by my name, the God of the Bible, as the Lord lives, as they taught my people to swear by Baal, then they shall be established in the midst of my people. Now let's just unpack that for a minute. What he's saying there, Jeremiah is saying that with the same zeal that you worship the God of Baal, the Jews back in the time when Jeremiah wrote, they were worshiping Baal and they were sacrificing their children to Baal. What zeal was that? A false God. God is saying, worship the true God with the same zeal that my people used to worship that false God. And I will have compassion on all of you. I will establish you in the midst of my people Israel. But here's the deal, folks. And remember, they're not worshiping the God of the Bible. They're worshiping Allah. Here's what he says. But if they do not obey these evil neighbors who got their statehoods, they're part of God's compassionate plan. If they do not obey, I will utterly pluck up and destroy that nation, says the Lord. Folks, we're talking about the destruction of Arab nations. And we have prophecies in Psalm 83 and toppling of Jordan in Jeremiah 49 and Zephaniah 2, destruction of Damascus and Isaiah 6. We have prophecies that seem to be related to them being out of compliance with God's plan, utterly being plucked up and destroyed.
So in God's compassionate peace plan for the Middle East, he's simply asking Saudi Arabia, Syria, UAE, and Bahrain, and any other Arab countries that would sign on to the Abraham Accords to worship him, the God of the Bible, like the Jews used to worship the false god Baal back in the time of Jeremiah. But are they worshiping God of the God of the Bible, Jehovah? Of course not. They're worshiping Allah. Now, some might say, well, aren't Allah and Jehovah the same God? Well, they're not. Let's look at some of the surahs here that show a distinct difference. We find in Surah 5:51 it says, O ye who believe, take not the Jews and the Christians for your friends and protectors. They are but friends and protectors to each other, and he amongst you that turns to them for friendship is of them. Verily, Allah guideth not an unjust people unjust. So if you're a Jew or a Christian, you're an unjust person according to the Quran, the Surah 5:51. Now some people try to join Islam and Christianity at the hip in what's called Chrislam, but here's a couple other surahs to look at that shows the dissection between the differences between the two religions. Surah 5:17 says Islam rejects the deity of Christ. Surah 4, 157 through 158 clearly says Islam rejects his death on the cross. Here's another one. Surah 4, 171 says it denies the Trinity. So believe in Allah and his apostles, say not Trinity. Desist, it will be better for you, for Allah is one, Allah. Glory be to him, far exalted is he above having a son. So Allah does not even have a son, but Christianity clearly says God has a son. He's got an only begotten Son in John 3:16. We sent to the world that whoever would believe in him would have not perish but have eternal life. But Allah has no son, far above him is even having a son. So they're not worshiping Jehovah, and they're out of sync with God's Middle East peace plan. They're out of sync with God's foreign policy in Genesis 12 as well. So strike one, these countries are out of sync with God's foreign policy in Genesis chapter 12. Strike 2, they are not worshiping Jehovah in compliance with God's peace plan for the Middle East in Jeremiah chapter 12. So let's look at number 3 here, Bible prophecy. They have roles in Bible prophecy. Are the prophecies about them, we'll start with Saudi Arabia, for instance, are they showing themselves as worthy participants of normalized relationships with Israel in these prophecies? I'm going to play you with Saudi Arabia a clip from a teaching I did, a video you can find on YouTube, and see on the bottom of the slide says, "Will Saudis normalize relations with or war against Israel?" So I'll show you a segment on that. We'll start with Saudi Arabia. What we can look at right now is the future according to unfulfilled biblical prophecies that affect Saudi Arabia in a relationship with Israel. There's actually 4 of them we're going to take a look at. I'm going to summarize these for you. I'll read them to you and then sort of summarize them for you and break them down as we go through further in the teaching. The first one is in Jeremiah chapter 49, verse 8. And what it says there is, "Flee, turn back, dwell in the depths, O inhabitants of Dedan," which would be northwest Saudi Arabia today. "For I will bring the calamity of Esau upon him, the time that I will punish him." Now Esau fathered the Edomites, and inside of the Palestinians today are ethnical representation from the Edomites' descendantry. So Dedan, Saudi Arabia, is going to be involved with the Palestinians, and they're being warned, don't be involved because the calamity is going to come upon Esau. There's going to be a judgment upon the Palestinians. So flee back, dwell in the depths. That's the first prophecy. The second prophecy shows up in Ezekiel 25, verses 12 through 14, which I'll read to you shortly. And what it says to Dedan, that it shall fall by the sword. So in other words, when that judgment comes, in Ezekiel 25, verses 12 through 14, we find that Dedan did not listen. They did not flee back from the depths. They get involved in the calamity of Esau, and many of them would die in this military confrontation. Then the third one, they're under the banner of the Ishmaelites in Psalm 83, verses 4 through 8. And what it says, I'm going to read this prophecy to you, but it says, "Come and let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be remembered no more. They form a confederacy, which includes the tents of Edom and the Ishmaelites," so the Palestinians and the Saudis. So we'll get into that in just a moment. But these 3 prophecies don't make an end to Saudi Arabia because they actually show up in a 4th prophecy. In Ezekiel 38, verses 13, "Sheba, Dedan, the merchants of Tarshish, and all their young lions will say to the Russian Confederacy of Ezekiel 38, have you come to take plunder?" So we'll get into that as well as I conclude. But those are the 4 main prophecies. The one that mainly involved the first 3, Dedan, and also the Ishmaelites, I believe, could be related to the final Arab-Israeli conflict, as pointed out in Psalm 83. So we'll take a look at that in just a moment. So apparently, according to prophecy number 4 on this list of 4 unfulfilled Saudi Arabia Bible prophecies, during the time of Ezekiel 38, apparently Saudi Arabia does establish normalized relationships with Israel, perhaps. They seem to be protesters on the sidelines, barking along the sidelines with the merchants of Tarshish and their young lions. So, but they seem to learn their lesson the hard way when you look at prophecies 1, 2, and 3, which seem to happen beforehand. And I want to pick up number 1 up here. It says in Jeremiah chapter 49, verse 8, a warning for Saudi Arabia to dwell in the depths, O inhabitants of Dedan, for the calamity of Esau is going to come upon him, the time that I will punish him. So I want to pick up on this calamity of Esau. Who is Esau? What is this calamity we're talking about? Why is Saudi Arabia involved and they need to be warned to pull back? Well, let's start by who is Esau and who did he father? He fathered the Edomites, who have ethnical representation in the Palestinians today. I point that out in my Psalm 83 Missing Prophecy Revealed book. We're told that in Genesis chapter 36 that Esau, his genealogy is in Edom. He was the father of the Edomites. They dwelled in ancient Mount Seir, which is in southern Jordan today. Now Saudi Arabia, whose father was pretty much Ishmael, who was the son of Abraham. He was the father of the Arabs. He has a historical strong background with Esau. Matter of fact, Esau married his daughter. We're told in Genesis 28, verse 9. Esau went to Ishmael and took Mahalath, the daughter of Ishmael, Abraham's son, the sister of Nebajoth, to be his wife in addition to the wives he had. So you see they have a long-standing history, Esau and Ishmael. And Esau's going to have a calamity that will be carried out to the Palestinians. And here's how this calamity is going to go down. And Esau's warned to get away from it when it happens. Obadiah 1:18 says, the house of Jacob shall be a fire, and the house of Joseph a flame. Read that as the Israeli Defense Forces. But the house of Esau, i.e. the Palestinians, shall be stubble, and no survivor shall remain of the house of Esau, for the Lord has spoken. Now this has not happened yet. The Israeli Defense Forces are going to take out all the descendants of Esau when they destroy the Arab states around them. I'll show you how that's going to happen shortly. This is a calamity of Esau. He will have no more descendants. Now, not all Palestinians have Edomite descent, but within the Palestinian ranks are many of Esau's descendants, and he will have no more. They will be destroyed. Now, the supporting scriptures on this is in Ezekiel 25, verses 13 and 14. Therefore, thus says the Lord God, I will also stretch out my hand against Edom, cut off man and beast from it, and make it desolate from Teman. Dedan shall fall by the sword. And I will lay my vengeance on Edom. And I say the tents of Edom because that's what they're called in Psalm 83. By the hand of my people Israel, we talked about the house of Jacob, the house of Joseph, fire and a flame. And they may do in Edom according to my anger and according to my fury, and they shall know my vengeance, says the Lord. So we see that Saudi Arabia is going to learn the hard way. They're involved in prophecies that are cursing Israel. They're siding up with the Palestinians. As we know, they want a Palestinian state. So their role in Bible prophecy is not copacetic until the end, after they learn the hard way in Ezekiel 38 perhaps. They're not copacetic with normalized relationships with Israel. They're antagonistic. Okay, so now let's turn our attention to Syria's future in Bible prophecy. We'll look to Isaiah 17. Verse 1, we have the burden against Damascus. Behold, Damascus will cease from being a city, and it will be a ruinous heap. One day Damascus, the oldest continuously inhabited city in history, the capital of Syria, will cease from being a city. It will be reduced to rubble. We find out that that is caused by the Israeli Defense Forces. In Isaiah 17 verse 9 it says, in the day that Syria gets reduced to rubble, his strong cities it will be as a forsaken bough and an uppermost branch which they left because of the children of Israel, the IDF. And there will be desolation. And we're told that this destruction will happen overnight. And behold, at eventide trouble, and before the morning he, speaking of Damascus, and the masculine pronoun is no more. This is the portion of those who plunder us, and a lot of those who rob us. That's Isaiah 17:14, closing out Isaiah's chapter. So we see that because Syria is guilty of plundering Israel, in self-defense Israel acts out and destroys the city. So we see that Syria, like Saudi Arabia in those first three prophecies of Saudi Arabia, is cursing Israel. So they're out of sync with God's Bible, and their role in Bible prophecy with the Abraham Accords. Now, of course, some people say, well, what about Jordan and Egypt? They have peace treaties with Israel already, but they're fragile and they will be voided out. I point this out in the Pre-Tribulation Prophecies DVD, which I'll show you in a minute here with Tom Hughes and me. See a list here, you can do a screenshot of the verses that show the IDF in Bible prophecies. We just talked about Syria in Isaiah 17. You can see Egypt and Jordan are listed in there in verses as well. So we're going to find out that Egypt and Jordan are also out of sync. They're not signing the Abraham Accords, although they may at some point, because they already have their fragile peace treaties with Israel. The DVD I'm referring to is called the Pre-Tribulation Prophecies. It's a prophetic documentary Tom Hughes and I did, and you can see all these wars that I just showed you on that prior screen. So thus far we found out that Saudi Arabia and Syria are out of alignment with God's foreign policy in Genesis 12, God's peace plan in Jeremiah 17, and their roles in Bible prophecies we just looked at are not copacetic with them having normalized relationships for any lasting period of time. Should they sign the Abraham Accords, they would go backtracking on that in those prophecies we talked about. But some people think Ezekiel 38 is also going to come out of this Abraham Accords. We'll address that in a moment. We haven't talked much about the UAE or Bahrain, but they're hard to find in prophecies in the future. But we did find out that they're out of sync with those headlines I read to you earlier with God's foreign policy. So that sort of puts them out of the picture as well. Now, Morocco and Sudan we didn't talk much about. They're already signers of the Abraham Accords. We're going to look at them right now. They actually are antagonistic in the Ezekiel 38 prophecy. Ezekiel 38, some of you may be familiar with it, but if you're not, I'll just do a brief overview of it and tell you why some people think that the Abraham Accords could create the peaceful people. A prerequisite of Ezekiel 38, the Israelis dwelling in peace and security as a result of the Abraham Accords. We're going to look at that closely now. Ezekiel 38 talks about a list of invaders by their ancient names. You see their modern day equivalents on the left side. Russia, Turkey, Iran, Ethiopia. See Sudan's there, a participant in this confederacy. Somalia, Libya, Algeria, probably Morocco. Again, another signer of the Abraham Accord, and Tunisia. They form an outer ring of countries. There's a map of them with their ancient names used by Ezekiel or their modern day equivalents. Outer ring of countries. They're going to invade Israel in the latter days for plunder and booty. And we find out in Ezekiel chapter 38, verses 7 through 13, several important details. And among those details, number 5, we see that they're going to be a peaceful people. Number 6, dwelling in a land of unwalled villages. Number 7, dwelling securely without walls, bars, nor gates. We find out 8 and 9 that the rest is coming with its coalition for Israel's prosperity, silver and gold, acquired livestock and goods, booty and great plunder. So some people say the Abraham Accords are going to lead to this peaceful people, the unwalled villages, the safe dwelling securely without walls, bars, nor gates. The Hebrew words talk about dwelling securely in a couple places, dwelling safely, the words of Yeshua V'tak. The Jews are brought out of the nations and they dwell safely. On land of unwalled villages, verse 11, peaceful people who dwell safely, Yeshua V'tak. So they think the Abraham Accords are going to create this scenario. But this is not how we find out they dwell securely. It's not politically. It's militarily. We find that out in Ezekiel 28 and elsewhere when the Jews will dwell as a peaceful people dwelling securely. Ezekiel 28 verses 24 through 26 tell us they can't dwell securely because there's a pricking briar and a painful thorn of the house of Israel from among those around them who despise them, and they shall know I'm the Lord God someday. In other words, the reason they can't dwell securely is because there's got these countries around them, namely you got Syria and Saudi Arabia among them, who despise Israel, and we're told that they will dwell securely when judgments are executed upon them. And the next verses 25 and 26 of Ezekiel 28. And here's what it says. This says, Lord God, when I have gathered the house of Israel from the peoples among whom they are scattered, and have hallowed in them in the sight of the Gentiles, then they will dwell in their own land which I have given to my servant Jacob, and they will dwell safely, same words, Yeshua V'tak. They'll build houses and plant vineyards, yes, they will dwell securely, same words. But when I execute judgment on all those around them who despise them, then they shall know the Lord, that I am the Lord their God. So it's not the Abraham Accords that creates this dwelling safely scenario of Ezekiel 38, but it's when judgments are executed upon those around them who despise them. And those people around them who despise them are also listed in Psalm 83. I believe that's a prophecy that's unfulfilled. The Arab countries around them, you see a map here. Includes Lebanon, where Hezbollah are, Syria. We talked about them. Iraq, Jordan, Palestinians, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Gaza, where the Hamas are. Here's another comparison map. These have been Israel's notorious enemies. They're around them and they despise Israel. That's why Israel can't dwell securely. The Abraham Accords will not create that scenario in Ezekiel 38, in my estimation. So comparatively different. You see an inner circle of countries in Psalm 83 versus that outer ring of countries in Ezekiel 38. Now what are the judgments to be executed upon those people around Israel that despise them, so that Israel can dwell securely? We find out in Zechariah 12 how that's going to conclude. I believe it's the conclusion of Psalm 83, the war prophecy of Psalm 83. Zechariah 12 tells us the time is going to come when there's people around about, those people around Israel that despise them, that don't allow them to dwell safely, and as they siege around Judah and Jerusalem, it says, "Behold, I will make Jerusalem a cup of trembling or dizziness," in some translations, unto all the people round about, not the nations of the world at large, but the people round about, those around Israel that despise them, when they lay siege both against Judah and against Jerusalem. So they're going to come against Judah and Jerusalem in a final siege, and God's going to judge them, and he's going to empower the IDF, and we're told in Zechariah 12 verse 6, 4 verses later, when this happens, he's going to empower the IDF to do the following. In that day that Jerusalem becomes a cup of trembling, I'll make the governors, that is the IDF, the captains of Judah, like a firebrand in the woodpile, and like a fiery torch in the sheaves, and they shall devour all those surrounding peoples on the right hand and on the left. But Jerusalem shall again be inhabited in her own place. Now that's when the peace and safety can happen for Israel, when they no longer have the pricking briar and painful thorn around them, after the IDF defeats them. And I showed you that screen a few slides back, the IDF and Bible prophecies. So it's all kind of interrelated to this climactic conclusion in Zechariah 12:6. So I want to move on from Ezekiel 38 to the covenant of Daniel 9:27, but I do want to clarify. When I showed this slide a few slides back, I mentioned that God's peace plan was in Jeremiah chapter 17, but I've been explaining it's actually in Jeremiah chapter 12, verses 14 through 17. So just wanted to clarify that. I apologize. Let's move on to the other argument that some are now saying, some of the Bible prophecy teachers are saying that the Abraham Accords will possibly lead to the peace that comes for the covenant of Daniel 9:27, which is also mentioned in Isaiah 28 verses 15, a covenant with death and Sheol. Sheol in the Hebrew, Hades is in the Greek, same word. Let's look at those covenants and see if there's any correlation here with the Abraham Accords. In 9:27, the covenant of Israel, and he, referring to the Antichrist, shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, Israel and many. But in the middle of the week he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering, and on the wing of abomination shall be one who makes desolate even until the consummation, which is determined, is poured out on the desolate. So the Antichrist is going to confirm a covenant between Israel. He'll be a political figure, much like Bill Clinton confirmed a covenant with Jordan and Israel in 1994, and Jimmy Carter confirmed a covenant with Egypt and Israel. So this Israel will trust this political leader at the time to confirm a covenant. So Daniel 9:27 gives us the following details. It'll be a 7-year term. Be confirmed by the Antichrist with the many. We're not told who they are, not in this passage. It seems to enable the temple to be built and the sacrifices and offerings to be performed. But the Antichrist will annul the covenant at the midpoint by stopping the sacrifices and offerings. And through an abominable act, he makes the temple desolate. He desecrates the temple. So that gives us some important details, but it doesn't tell us the motive, which is important. Why does Israel couldn't get involved in this false covenant? Who is the other signatory? Who's the many? So we need a few more details that fortunately we get from Isaiah 28, verses 14 and 15. Which says, "Therefore hear the word of the Lord, you scornful men who rule these people who are in Jerusalem, because you have said, we have made a covenant with death, and with Sheol we are in agreement. When the overflowing scourge passes through, it will not come to us, for we have made lies our refuge, and under falsehood we've hidden ourselves." So we get some details here that are very important. Scornful rulers at the time make a covenant with the other signatories, death and Sheol. We have to put a face on who they are. But the motive is because there's an overflowing scourge that's sweeping through the world that Israel is concerned about. So we line these up next to each other. We got Daniel 9:27. We talked about those details. Isaiah 28 tells us the other signatory is death and Sheol. Sheol in Hebrew, Hades in the Greek. Israel's motivation is to avoid an overflowing scourge. Israel's participation involves lies and falsehood. And we find out in verse 18 of Isaiah 28 that the covenant will be annulled, much in correlation with Daniel 9:27 at the midpoint of the tribulation. So the lies and falsehood, it's politically expedient for Israel to get involved. There's lies and falsehood involved by the scornful rulers. But who's death and Sheol, and what's the overflowing scourge? We find out probably who death and Sheol is the fourth horseman of the apocalypse in Revelation chapter 6, verses 7 through 8. We're told that when he opened the fourth seal of the seventh seal of judgments, the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature saying, "Come and see." So I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and on the name of him who sat on it was Death, and Hades, or Sheol in the Hebrew, followed with him, and power was given to them over a fourth of the earth to kill with sword, with hunger, and death by the beasts of the earth. So here's death and Sheol, death and Hades, the fourth horseman. They come on the scene, and they're killing a lot of people. They have authority over a quarter of the earth to kill through multiple means. A lot of my colleagues say, well, they're killing a quarter of the earth, maybe 1 billion people at that time. But that's not clearly what it says. But they do appear to be death and Hades perpetrating an overflowing scourge. In Isaiah 28:15, this could be who they're talking about here in Revelation chapter 6. But they're talking about they have authority over a quarter of the earth. Let's compare that to another verse to see if they're actually killing a quarter of the earth. So they could be killing more people if it's not exactly what it says. So they have authority or power was given to them, in some translations, over a fourth of the earth to kill with sword, hunger, and death by the beasts of the earth. Let's compare that to an entirely different judgment, the sixth trumpet judgment. We're clearly told that 3 plagues come and a third of mankind was killed, not authority over a third of mankind, but killing of a third of mankind, which was by fire and the smoke and the brimstone which came over their mouths. So basically, I believe what we're being told here is that the overflowing scourge is being perpetrated by death and Hades, whoever they represent at that time, and I explained who I think that is in my Last Prophecies book. The last prophecies of the first 3.5 years of the tribulation. They're killing a lot of people. They have authority over the quarter of the earth to kill lots of people who dissent from their agenda. I believe that's the overflowing scourge that Israel is concerned that they don't want to be swept away with. They're part of the killing campaign. So I don't believe it's the Abraham Accords that leads to the peace of that motivates Israel to be involved in that covenant. I believe it's the overflowing scourge, Isaiah 28 verses 15. So in conclusion, we're probably going to be hearing a lot of discussion on the importance of the Abraham Accords and perhaps the new signatories, including Syria and Saudi Arabia, to name a few. But as we reflect upon the 5 points we discussed in this teaching, it does not seem to be biblically endorsed. They're out of alignment, Saudi Arabia and Syria, the UAE and Bahrain, with God's foreign policy. They're not actually blessing Israel. They're out of alignment with God's Mideast peace plan in Jeremiah chapter 12, verses 14 through 17, whereby God's compassionate peace plan asks the nations, Syria and Saudi Arabia, for instance, to worship Jehovah like the Jews used to worship the false god Baal during Jeremiah's time. They're not doing that, they're worshiping Allah. We looked at the Bible prophecy roles that they have, Syria and Saudi Arabia and Sudan and Morocco. Sudan and Morocco in Ezekiel 38, Syria in Isaiah 17, probably in Psalm 83 and Zechariah 12, verse 6. Saudi Arabia and those four unfulfilled prophecies we talked about as well. Their roles do not seem to be copacetic with normalized relationships in those prophecies. We looked at the Abraham Accords. Could they be what causes the safe-dwelling Israel, the peaceful people without walls, bars, or gates, in Ezekiel 38? And we find out, no, that's not how they dwell securely. They dwell securely when judgments are executed upon those around them who despise them, according to Ezekiel 28, verses 24 through 26, whereby there's a pricking briar, painful thorn around Israel that prohibits them from dwelling securely. It has to be taken out, which will be taken out probably in Zechariah 12:6. And we also looked at, could it be that the Abraham Accords create the environment that segues into the signing of the false covenant of Daniel 9:27 and Isaiah 28:15, and we realize the motivation is not the Abraham Accords, but it is the overflowing scourge being perpetrated by probably the fourth horseman of the apocalypse, death and Hades, that motivates Israel to get involved in the Daniel 9:27 covenant. So I hope this study has helped you out. The Abraham Accords, although they seem beneficial on the surface, they do not appear to be biblically endorsed for the following 5 reasons we just discussed in this video.